This is misuse of patents, because the whole point is to encourage competitive invention, not just to protect the patent holder. And I was very delighted that in a case recently brought against Myriad Genetics, who holds some of these patents, it was brought by a consortium including the American Civil Liberties Union, the practice of gene patenting was judged by a New York court to be illegal. It's on the Federal Circuit. And it's a wonderful step in the right direction, and we're going to see now what the appeal process does to it. But we have similar developments going forward in Europe, so I'm hopeful. Anyway, excessive reliance on intellectual property rights leads to some unfortunate consequences in terms of the product, but also is bad for the internal conduct of science, in that patents, far from leading to openness, as people often claim, frequently lead to secrecy until they're issued and to blocks thereafter. And we have research exemptions, but since universities are now locked into the commercial reward system, most are doing pre-commercial research and aren't eligible. All these issues are explored further in the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation's Manchester Manifesto, which you can find on our website. Was signed by 50 contributors, including a number of the participants here today. So you'll be able to discuss these matters with them in the reception afterwards. So coming back to my thoughts about the way we've shifted from one sort of funding to another, these inefficiencies would really be alleviated if we could restore public funding to once again create a better balance. But where's that funding to come from? For the moment, actually, the main sources of public revenue for global health are charitable, the Gates Foundation being in the lead, but with many others. And they're actually working well to finance public-private development partnerships that are leading now to some new treatments for neglected diseases, including malaria. But this present relief should not cause complacency. Philanthropy, of course, has a long and honourable history, and indeed before the 20th century, the funding of science by patronage or personal private means was usual. But financially, this is asking for a great deal, and many consider it unaffordable. We find, of course, that people tend to prefer a flutter on the state lottery or the stock exchange rather than paying taxes, and actually most of our savings and pensions are financed through mutuals, which in turn depend on the value of stock, and so fix us all for our welfare into the existing system. And there are various practical proposals to correct the problems, biomedical treaties, prize systems, market commitments, but they leave the existing system pretty much intact and don't address the deep problems. Maybe we can't address the deep problems, I don't know, but I think we should be thinking about it, how we can convince people to reorganize. Because whatever the exact tactics for going forward, the common ground is that, frankly, the unregulated free market inevitably fails to provide many of the goods that collectively we acknowledge are needed. Now, economists have a word for this. They use the term market failure for this result. But you know what? This always makes me think of a man in a spacesuit on the moon. He removes his helmet. What happens? He dies, gasping, atmospheric failure, atmospheric failure. There was no atmosphere in the first place. So it is with so-called market failure. It's a euphemism that's something that's missing altogether from standard economic models. Now, these remarks, of course, fly despicably in the face of current norms. But I don't believe that current norms will secure our future, nor were they important in the past. Think of the early days of vaccines. Again, as you were just reminded of in the introduction, it was not accidental that Jonas Salk, when asked whether he'd patented that first polio vaccine, replied, "Would you patent the sun?" The answer is that, of course, now we would. Furthermore, we'd patent the stars, so the aliens have to pay for their sunlight as well. Now, there's a line of justification that people are using quite a bit at the moment. I'm continually struck by. It appeals to Charles Darwin. and the concept of evolution to defend current practices. Now, the extraordinary insight of evolution theory is that all the complexity of life is explained by competition for reproductive success, building on variation introduced by that same process of reproduction, so that constantly new life forms emerge and replace the old. And our more bullish brethren like to feel that the rather unfortunate phrase that Darwin used, survival of the fittest, is tailor-made for them and justifies the most ruthless behavior in competing with their fellows. I'm sure you all know people like that. Now, last year, being Darwin's centenary, comments along these lines came up rather frequently. So I think it's worth considering what we should actually learn from Darwin of matters sociological. This rather flies in the face of my not referring to ancients, but just this once, and it's sociology anyway. Darwin was a product of his age and class. He was an advanced humanitarian, for example, in his abolitionist views on slavery, but at the same time, he was effortlessly confident in the superiority of his own people. I suspect, actually, he was well aware of the sea change in evolution that humans represent, and to which I'll return in a moment. But for people of his day, the world seemed ordered and progressive, and it was reasonable to think that natural selection might continue to take us forward. But we've now reached what is in some ways, not all, a bleaker patch in human history. Because notwithstanding previous false alarms, we're now coming up against limits to the endless extension of simple competitiveness, the survival of the fittest. And a common error is to conflate the solidly grounded account of human origins that natural selection does provide with the need to plan wisely our social and economic arrangements. And there's no reason at all why we should use knowledge of our past as directing our future. Through both innovation and understanding, indeed, science continually betters the human condition. But of late, there's arisen a careless assumption that all innovation is good. It's spoken of politically as the one goal that science and technology must strive for. It fits well with free market philosophy and compares favorably, of course, with stagnation from hidebound subservience to unchanging doctrines, which I certainly don't subscribe to. But the free market, which is such a wonderful servant on the small scale, is a dangerous master applied on the global scale. Because driven by economic competition, innovation is proceeding at a frenzied pace, making us more and more successful to the point where we are damaging the earth. Because it's increasingly evident that our only enemy is ourselves. Too many people consuming too many resources in a world which, far from being made more equal by globalization, is really more unequal than ever by many measures. Because each government, trapped by the imperative to compete in the world market, feels obliged to drive its scientists to innovate and its consumers to consume, all in the name of its gross domestic product, its GDP. No matter that we know GDP doesn't equate to happiness, nor that competition to rivalrously increase all the GDPs is destroying the planet. Now, at this point, I have to admit that some authors are critical, some quite desperately critical of this negative perspective as they see it. They call it pessimistic. They complain that I'm spreading gloom. What do they want? Do they want a careless world of false optimism, people manipulated by self-serving advertising, lulled by smooth words into complacency? That's exactly how we've drifted into financial recession, and how we shall continue to drift towards far more catastrophic events if we ignore the issues. It's understandable that many, faced with such complexity, find the selective punditry of the so-called optimists persuasive, yet they are utterly misleading. I reject the label of pessimist, but I'm rather a real optimist who believes in a great future for us, which we can bring about if we act thoughtfully and ethically. No, indeed, the future doesn't have to be bleak at all, but there is a pressing need to put our house in order. Now, scientists could contribute greatly by adopting a more proactive stance in applying discoveries to collective good rather than enrichment of the few, if the system allowed them to do so. However, at the moment, the system encourages the opposite, and personal enrichment is presented to young scientists as the only path of good sense and indeed of virtue. We've already trained a generation, maybe two, into economic pragmatism, sometimes even greed, and they are busily passing on this worldly wisdom to their students. So how do we proceed? Well, in order to be successful, a society has the need to balance different interests. And I've touched on some of these in exploring the way science operates. Democratic government is supposed to fulfill this role of balancing, but it's increasingly hobbled by forces enmeshing it, the urgency of the next election, and particularly by the power of commercial lobbyists who are more and more well organized and spend a great deal of money persuading governments into lines that suit them. Corporate responsibility is supposed to offset this trend and indeed can do something, but let's face it, a company has only a limited range of maneuver in a competitive environment. Through it runs the fourth estate of the media. Well, I've had lots of experience now with media, not just today, and I despair at times, don't we all, of the search for novelty, the lust for conflict, the misleading headlines that arise. But I understand full well how they arise. It's because we have to have a competitive press. That's how it works. The consequence, though, of this frantic search for novelty is a dispiriting sort of populism in politics that makes it very difficult for even the best intentioned leaders to follow a rational course. Restraint buys few votes. Greed is good. Yet there is no alternative to a free and therefore competitive press if we want transparency in our democracy and politics. This was brought home to me rather forcefully 10 years ago when I sort of imagined that the press could somehow always go along in a rational way. But where that leads us, if we're not careful, is succumbing to a monopolistic press. And those countries that do that suffer badly. Years ago, a journalist in Romania brought this home to me when she phoned to ask something about the Human Genome Project. And I said, oh, the press coverage wasn't too good. I didn't like what they were doing. But she said, how would you like to have a single media controlled by the state? This was from Romania. Yes, indeed. And actually in Britain right now, we have to beware lest we hand over our press to the empire of Rupert Murdoch, who's trying to buy it all up. No, there's no question. The media is essential just as science is, just as universities are. It's always important in communication. It needs to be free, it needs to be competitive, it needs to write its headlines. It's sometimes a campaigning force, but inevitably it has to face all ways to channel our various views. So who do we have left who may strike the balance? Well, for the moment, I think, above all, we're left with the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, as key players. They're a highly eclectic bunch, but they're truly democratic, except a few who get hobbled by special interests, but they are so important collectively that they're now known as civil society. And this is where, surprisingly for some perhaps, I turn again to the universities. Because beyond research, beyond teaching, the great universities